This video is brought to you by Brilliant. On Sunday, Venezuela went to the polls to elect its president. The two leading candidates on the ballot were incumbent Nicolas Maduro, who's been in power since he took over from Hugo Chavez in 2013, and Edmundo Gonzalez, an independent candidate representing the opposition alliance who stepped in after the leading opposition candidate, popular conservative Maria Corina Machado, was barred from participating on spurious charges by the Venezuelan government in 2023. Hours after the polls closed, the government-controlled National Electoral Council published implausible partial results suggesting Maduro had eked out a victory with 51% of the popular vote, sparking widespread protests across the country. Now, at the time of writing, it's unclear how this unrest will end, whether it'll finally force Maduro out or whether he'll be able to weather the storm, as he's done in the past. Whatever happens though, the post-election unrest has shone a light on Venezuela's appalling economic crisis, which has turned it from one of the wealthiest countries in South America to one of the poorest, and is one of the big reasons that the official results are so implausible. After all, who'd vote for someone who'd presided over basically a decade of recession? So in this video, we thought we'd take a brief look at Venezuela's election results, its ongoing economic crisis, and what might happen next. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So before we get into Venezuela's economic crisis, let's take a quick look at the election and why it was almost definitely rigged. There are a whole load of reasons to be skeptical of the official results. For starters, Maduro and his allies have been steadily centralizing power since they lost the local assembly elections in 2015 to insulate him from democratic pressure. On top of that, polls before the election had Gonzalez leading by between 20 to 30 points, and a series of exit polls after the election found similar results. One exit poll by Edison Research, for instance, had Gonzalez leading by 65% to 31%, while another by an anonymous NGO shared with The Economist put Gonzalez on 67%. The opposition themselves claim that they won by an even larger margin, putting Gonzalez on 73% of the vote, based on their own counts gathered from individual polling stations. These individual polling stations were meant to print their own results, to allow the result to be verified, but this hasn't happened, at least officially. Instead, the opposition appointed witnesses at each polling station to make copies of each voting record, and then used them to compose their own results. But perhaps the most damning evidence of interference is the fact that, if you look at the vote tally claimed by the government and then translate it into percentages, they come out at perfectly rounded numbers with a single decimal place. Mathematically, this is nearly impossible, and it's pretty definitive proof that Maduro and his allies just made up their ideal percentages and then translated them into votes. Anyway, you get the idea. Despite what the government claimed, Maduro clearly didn't win the election. And, well, this is unsurprising, given that he's presided over one of the worst economic crises in modern history. While Venezuela stopped publishing official data in 2015, which is never a good sign, IMF estimates suggest Venezuela's GDP per capita is currently just $8,000, and half what it was in 2008, and one of the lowest in South America. And this is an improvement on 2020, when GDP per capita bottomed out at just over $5,000. When you take into account Venezuela's depopulation, this means that in Maduro's first 7 years in power, Venezuela's overall GDP fell by an astonishing 75%. Anyway, Venezuela's GDP per capita today is one of the lowest in South America. But what makes this even more remarkable is the fact that, only a few decades ago, Venezuela was literally the richest country in the region. According to IMF data, in 1980, Venezuela had an inflation-adjusted GDP per capita of about $8,000, which is roughly the same as it is today. This made it the richest country in South America, which had an average GDP per capita of about $5,000, and about 30% richer than second-placed Argentina. To make matters even worse, GDP figures probably underestimate the severity of Venezuela's economic crisis, because a large fraction of its GDP is oil revenue, which doesn't trickle down to ordinary Venezuelans. Thanks to rampant inflation, which peaked at something like 300,000% in 2019 and is still running above 50% year on year, most Venezuelans have seen steep decreases in their real wages, and something like 80% of the population today live in poverty. So how did this happen? Well, arguably, the structural cause of Venezuela's economic woes is its enormous oil reserves. For context, Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the entire world, but this has actually been bad news for its economy for at least 3 reasons. First, its dependence on oil exports has undermined its other exports, because, at least in the past, demand for Venezuelan oil has appreciated its currency, making its other exports less competitive. Second, Venezuela's nationalized oil company, PDVSA, has nurtured a corrupt elite of industry insiders and politicians who keep the proceeds to themselves. And third, it's made the country dangerously reliant on global oil prices, because when oil prices are high, the government spends instead of saves, which means that when oil prices fall, revenue collapses, and the government often resorts to money printing to make ends meet, stoking inflation. This is exactly what happened when Maduro came to power in 2013. Less than a year later, oil prices collapsed from a high of $112 per barrel in June 2014 to a low of $31 per barrel in January 2016. This was disastrous for the Venezuelan state because oil exports finance about 2/3 of the budget. The subsequent collapse in living standards provoked massive anti-Maduro protests, which simmered along for nearly 4 years between 2014 and 2018. The crisis was exacerbated by chronic mismanagement of PDVSA by Maduro and his cronies, with oil output falling to its lowest level since 1945, and American sanctions, which were first imposed in 2006, and have limited the country's ability to export oil or import essential goods. Sanctions were loosened by the Biden administration last year in an attempt to convince Maduro to hold free and fair elections, and also bring down global oil prices. But the electoral fraud that we've just witnessed meant that they'll probably be reimposed soon. If Maduro isn't ousted, however, it's hard to see Venezuela's economy recovering in any meaningful sense. While GDP has grown in the past few years, that's largely a consequence of a rise in oil prices, and not much of this trickles down to ordinary Venezuelans. Furthermore, some 8 million Venezuelans, roughly a quarter of the entire population, has apparently emigrated since Maduro took power, and this trend will only accelerate if he can hold on. One opinion poll from before the election, for instance, found that 1/3 of the remaining population would consider migrating if Maduro won another term. This risks creating a vicious cycle, because depopulation hurts the economy, which encourages further depopulation ad infinitum. Be sure to keep an eye on this story as it evolves, as much like every area of our lives, this is likely to progress quickly. In fact, if you're feeling left behind by the news cycle and fast developments in AI and tech, you'll want to check out Brilliant. Brilliant is where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in maths, data analysis, programming, and AI. Learning a little every day is one of the most important things you can do, both for personal and professional growth. Brilliant helps you build real knowledge in minutes a day, with fun lessons you can do whenever you have time. It's the opposite of mindless scrolling and truly helps you to learn quickly, kind of like TLDR. One course I've found to be particularly interesting was their course on large language models. We hear a lot about AI and large language models in the news, but Brilliant helped me actually get hands-on with real language models as you explore how they build vocabulary, choose their next word, and more. They also helped me grasp the importance of training data by comparing models trained on Taylor Swift lyrics to models trained on a cookbook or big text terms and conditions. If you want to learn more and understand the world around you better, whether that's in order to get a job in AI or just to understand what everyone's talking about, you can try everything that Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days. Visit brilliant.org/TLDR or click on the link in the description. Plus, you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thanks for watching, and to Brilliant for sponsoring this video.